This video will contain spoilers for the first season of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms and the first novella it's adapting, but otherwise I will try to avoid giving away key points from future stories not yet adapted to screen. You have been warned. In the first novella of the Dunk and Egg short stories, The Hedge Knight, as Dunk is preparing for battle in the Trial of Seven, he looks upon the crowd that's gathered to watch and assumes bitterly that they've all come to watch him die. It's only a few moments later that he understands why they're really there. Various members of the crowd give him words of encouragement. "Good fortune to you. May the gods give you strength, sir." A begging brother in a tattered brown robe blesses his sword, and a maid kisses him on the cheek, and Dunk realizes they're for him, not against him. He turns to his armsman Pate and asks, "But why? What am I to them?" And Pate replies, "A knight who remembered his vows." George R.R. Martin has been on record saying that the Dunk and Egg novellas are some of his favorite things that he's ever written, and I think that exchange is the perfect microcosm of why that is, even if it was unfortunately not included in the show, which showrunner Ira Parker has come to regret. Because A Song of Ice and Fire is typically maligned by its naysayers as grim-dark or cynical. It's garnered a reputation over the years for trying to be morally gray, as though to imply that there's no clear-cut definition of good and evil to be found within the text. And it's not hard to understand why so many people think this thanks to the mainline series ending the way that it did. There's much that can be said about the way HBO chose to adapt these books with Game of Thrones, but the most succinct way I can put it is, it often tries a little too hard to appeal to certain early 2010s audiences with more gritty aesthetics and washed out colors. And that, coupled with the fact that it's a lot more brutal than your typical fantasy story, has given off the wrong impression about Gurm's outlook on the world. Those who deride the world George created will often cite such moments as the Red Wedding or Ned Stark's execution as evidence that heroic, noble characters never actually win, and they're punished more often than not for being a good person. But this really couldn't be further from the truth. A Song of Ice and Fire is, and has always been, a lot more black and white than a lot of people pretend it is. There are pretty clear-cut good versus evil characters, and said evil characters always get their comeuppance one way or the other. And the fact that some good characters also face hardship or death for attempting to maintain their moral values isn't antithetical to the idea that good will ultimately triumph. It's complementary to that fact. The world in which these stories are set is oftentimes gruesome and difficult, and a main point in the series is that the systems in place are not perfect. They often require good men to do horrible things to maintain an ill-gotten sense of honor, and the books are very critical of that fact. Jaime Lannister is treated as a pariah for murdering his king, one who he swore to protect, and it turns him cynical. Jaime looks at the unfair and often contradictory systems in play and decides that if that's how the world is gonna be, then he'll respond in kind. He abandons the concept of honor altogether, believing it's something he could never hope to attain again anyway, and spends years debasing himself, giving into cruelty and malice. But the books have always depicted this as wrong, and it took him losing a hand and spending time with Brienne to start pulling him out of that way of thinking, to critically examine his own sense of morality and figure out how to apply that to the world around him, even if it doesn't always respond in kind. But that's the answer. Most of the time, it's hard to be a good person. It's hard to do the right thing. You may even be punished for it, but that doesn't mean you should stop trying. Sir Duncan the Tall is that entire idea distilled into a single character, which is why it honestly wouldn't surprise me one bit if George came out and said Dunk was his favorite character. He perfectly represents Gurm's own outlook on the world, and nothing encapsulates that better than when he saves Tanzel from Arian's wrath in both the book and the show. When he faces execution or dismemberment for the crime of striking a prince who was hurting an innocent. It's the same dichotomy Jaime faced with Aerys, just on a much smaller scale. Uphold your vows to protect the innocent and defend the weak, or obey your king, or in this case, prince.
Defend the king, obey the king. Protect the innocent, defend the weak. What if the king massacres the innocent? It's too much. No matter what you do, you're forsaking one vow or another.
The only difference is that Dunk didn't let that change who he was. He didn't let the world make him think his actions were wrong. He stood fast against those who would tell him he did wrong, that he threw his life away, and he fought to defend his innocence at great cost. And something that's only ever hinted at in the books, but was basically outright confirmed in the final episode of the show, is that Dunk was never actually knighted by Sir Arlen like he claimed. I saw much debate about that topic as the episodes were releasing because the books are intentionally vague on the subject, but considering how closely involved Gurm was here and how happy he seemed with the final product, it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to assume the same is true in the book continuity as well, and will probably end up being said outright if George ever gets around to writing more of them. And what this means is that in order to be a knight, in order to uphold this standard of honor and justice, Dunk has found himself in a position where he has to lie to get what he wants, and that's not exactly honorable. Yet despite this, he still represents everything a knight is meant to stand for, when there are plenty of true knights by technicality who would have turned the other way when they saw an innocent woman being harassed by their prince. The point is meant to be that concepts of honor and chivalry transcend arbitrary systemic arbitrations of what you are. You should uphold them even when the system itself argues that you shouldn't, and even if you feel like you've told a monstrous lie to do it, as Dunk reflects on in the book. I've been waxing lyrical about the overall thematic point of the Dunk and Egg stories and how they're written in the books, but have done very little to discuss the show so far. And this is because I really wanted to set the stage for what this thing is, and what you should understand about it if you're gonna watch the show, which I highly recommend doing. My stance on the show is simply that it's such a faithful one-to-one adaptation of the source material that basically everything I've talked about so far from the books applies here too. I have never been one to argue that a thing needs to be a perfect adaptation for it to be good, but I also believe that if it ain't broke, you shouldn't try to fix it, and there is very little this show could add that wasn't already in the books that would vastly improve it. But for those of you who haven't read the books or seen the show, and you're looking for advice about whether or not to watch it, I've already given you some pretty major spoilers for season 1, but I still think it's worth giving a watch. It's only about 6 episodes, and they're not particularly long. And at first I was worried when I found out how many episodes there would be, because the stories being adapted really are pretty short, and by the time we reached the end of episode 4, I started to really panic about how the next 2 episodes were gonna feel pacing-wise. It didn't seem like the Trial of Seven and its aftermath could be spread across 2 more episodes, and when I found out episode 5 would be a flashback-heavy one, I started holding my breath. But I can happily say that episode 5 is probably the best episode of the whole show, and is one of my favorites in the entire Game of Thrones canon. The flashbacks never overstay their welcome, they're paced really well, and they serve as a complementary parallel to the main action happening in the present day. It's to a point where this is the one big show-only addition that I'd say truly enhances the story in a way that's absent from the source material, because none of this is in the books. My only real issue with the flashbacks is I think it's pretty stupid how long Dunk lasted on that flesh wound before succumbing to an infection, and I think they could have just improved it slightly if they'd at least had him poorly bandage it beforehand or something. And speaking of things that aren't in the book, most of the final episode dealing with the trial's aftermath is made up for the show, explaining even further how they managed to stretch so little story content into 2 whole episodes. But just like with episode 5, none of it felt out of place, and I think that's because Ira Parker clearly understands this story very well. So when he makes things up, he does so with a purpose, and with a clear idea of what makes sense for the story. There is, however, one exception to this praise, and it comes right at the very end of the season. It seems like the episode ends with Dunk and Egg riding off into the sunset, off to see new lands and have new adventures, only for the show to hit us with one final scene of Mykar realizing Egg is, once again, missing, and it's treated like a funny gag. The thing is, in the books, it's never outright stated that Mykar agreed to let Egg go with Dunk to live as a peasant. The show technically depicts these events the same way as they happen in the book, but with this one additional scene. So you could make the argument that this is just another example of the show adding details based on what's clearly intended by George in the narrative, like with Dunk not really being a knight. But I actually think it's pretty important for Mykar's character that he sends Egg off with Dunk. Part of the argument Dunk makes to convince him to do that is that it'll force Egg to mingle with the commoners and experience some humility, something which was clearly lacking in the upbringing of Mykar's other sons. So the implication was that he actually did consent to it because he wanted Egg to grow up differently. Egg is his final son, his final chance to get things right after failing so much, so many times. And I think removing that choice from him undermines that narratively. So if this is an example of the show adding shit at the behest of George, then I think George made a mistake wanting to include this. However, more likely than not, it's a thing the showrunners added in as one final comedic bit without giving it much thought, and I think that's a shame. It's nowhere near a deal breaker, but it does disappoint me just a little bit. In any case, I think it's also worth mentioning this. If you've seen Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, and you're expecting this to be some big political show about war and scheming, you should temper your expectations somewhat, because that's not really what the show is about. It's a smaller scale story about 2 characters who will go on to be extremely historically relevant, but for the time being, they're just a couple of dudes chilling at a tournament. It's extremely low-key, and honestly kind of a vibe. We're allowed to just sit and hang out with these people for a little bit, and I think this is why they managed to squeeze 6 episodes out of a 120-page novella. A lot of the show is just Dunk and Egg sitting around eating food, drinking ale, watching puppet shows, that sort of thing, and I am absolutely here for it. I fucking adore their relationship in the books, and this show brings it to life brilliantly. George Martin told Egg's actor Dexter Solancel that he was as if the character himself had leapt out of the pages, and I really couldn't agree more. He perfectly encapsulates the character I imagined in my head as I was reading it, and I think he and Peter Claffey have pretty natural brotherly chemistry. My one tiny gripe is that I wish Dunk was a little younger than Claffey clearly is, since he's supposed to be like 17 at the oldest, and that is important because Dunk is kinda supposed to be an awkward teen still trying to figure stuff out.
The boys used to call me Tansel Too Tall.
You're not too tall. I mean, you're just right for...
For?
Puppets.
But these shows have never been strangers to aging up certain characters for various practical reasons, and I don't think it really matters that much anyway, because Peter Claffey still delivers on those elements of the character regardless. I don't really have that much else to say about the show other than that it's really wholesome, very engrossing, and absolutely knocks it out of the park in presentation. You can't help but just want to sit and enjoy this setting for hours at a time, and I am very pleased to give A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1 a 7.5 out of 10. Give it a watch if you haven't already, and if you don't, I will feed you to my dogs. I am not joking. Thank you guys so much for watching. Everyone always complains about me being too negative about everything, and it's not really my fault that most of the stuff I'm interested in has been really dropping the ball as of late. But Game of Thrones and its spin-offs kind of have a track record for starting off pretty strong, even if they eventually nosedive in quality. I'm not really worried about that happening here because, again, Ira Parker clearly loves the source material and wants to follow it as faithfully as he possibly can. So I don't foresee this going the way of the other two shows where the creatives decided they knew better than Gurm and ended up creating fucking garbage, to put it bluntly. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to House of the Dragon Season 3, and if you're curious to know why, you can check out a stream I did with Jolly and Odrin about Season 2 a couple years back, linked in the description. Alongside that, you'll also find links to various social media platforms I exist on, where I say funny things and everyone unanimously loves all of what I have to say. Just like here on YouTube. I also have a Discord server that you can join if you want, and you can support me financially by becoming a channel member or joining my Patreon, both of which give you early access to all my videos, and in the case of Patreon, sometimes grants you previews to stuff I'm working on way in advance. I'm currently in the process of making a 4-hour Stranger Things video, and it's taking me a while, but you can watch the first hour of that right now if you're curious. I've uploaded it over there. Otherwise, that's all I've got for you guys, and I will see you when I see you.